Welcome to Criticileye's Inspiring Leaders podcast, our series where we'll be speaking to executive and non-executive directors about what's really going on in boardrooms today, getting insights into the key issues around strategy, stakeholder management, leadership capability and board dynamics. My name is Marc Barber, Director of Content at Criticaleye, and today we'll be talking to you from our CEO retreat. Sharing their thoughts with us today, we have Fiona Ross, who is Chair of CIE, the NPHDB, and she has a non-executive director roles at the Scottish Government and is on the board of Network Rail, among other roles. We also have Rachel Osborne, who is currently non-executive director and audit committee chair at Ocado Group, a NED and Audit Chair at Marstons, and she's the former CEO of Ted Baker and has had CFO roles at Domino's Pizza Group and John Lewis, among others. They're both board mentors at Criticaleye. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Hi.
All right. So today we're looking at the role of the CEO at present, and just trying to sort of get into some thoughts around what it takes to be successful in the role. I suppose to kick it off, you're both independent directors, and so I thought in terms of an opening question, what do you want to see from a CEO? What do you think distinguishes the very best chief executives? So Fiona, if I could put that to you first.
Sure, absolutely, and it's a good question for us to reflect on, because sometimes we just kind of assume that we have a good CEO and things are working well, and it's not always the case. And also the opportunity if you are recruiting a CEO versus inheriting a CEO. So there's a couple of different nuances to that. But I think fundamentally, what I look for in a CEO is someone who can look both directions. They can look up to the board and they can look down to the organisation, and that's a skill in itself. And they wouldn't be in the role and they wouldn't be at the table to be considered for the role if they hadn't got the requisite qualifications, expertise, experience in that industry or sector. So when you're then looking for the kind of the softer skills that you're looking for at that particular stage. I'm also looking for energy, enthusiasm. I'm looking for a bit of lateral thinking, a little bit of sort of blue sky thinking that they might bring to bear, particularly at the interview or indeed during the course of their career. Someone obviously as chair or even as an independent director, someone you can work with, someone you can trust and respect. So they're the types of things, both hard and soft skills, that I'd be looking for in a CEO.
Okay, and I guess it'll be contextual as well. It'll vary based on where the organisation is at and where it's performing.
Absolutely, and again, from an SME right up through to private equity, which we heard about earlier today, up to PLC land, or right then into the state sector as well. So very different contexts can have a big impact on the type of CEO you might be looking for, and the skills they may bring to bear. Okay.
What do you think, again, like reflecting on some of the sessions this morning, and what you said there about the CEO being able to look up to the board but into the organisation, what are your thoughts around maybe where it's more difficult for a CEO adjusting? Would you say it's probably more lean towards the engagement with the board?
Yes, I think so. And I think, again, traditionally, I mean, a CEO or any senior management, they may fear the board, or they may have think of it as being a slightly adversarial relationship, and that's natural. You're reporting into the board, you're being held to account by the board or other shareholders or stakeholders. So it's really about making sure that sense of an adversarial relationship is balanced out by trust and respect and a mutual understanding of what you're trying to achieve in the organisation. And I think if you achieve that, then those challenges associated with becoming either a newly appointed CEO or a CEO starting with a new board, you understand that there is a parity of esteem that is at play, and I think that's really important. Board members traditionally want to love and respect their CEOs. That makes things easier for everybody if that's going on. But it's also for CEOs not to feel that they need to game the board or hold things back from the board, or, as I say, see it in an adversarial way. And if the CEO can spend the time with the chair, but also with the other non-execs, and I think that's something that's often missed, is that the nature of the relationship between the CEO and chair is so intense that sometimes the other INEDs or non-execs feel a little bit left out of that. So I think it's really important that the CEO spends time with other non-execs, and indeed then brings his or her senior management team to the board as often as possible as well.
Which feeds into that point about trying to sort of gauge whether you have the chemistry and that this is someone that you can trust and really work with.
Absolutely.
Okay. Rachel, what are your thoughts around this as an independent director, former CEO? You've sort of seen it from different perspectives, haven't you?
I have. I'd say what would make a good chief executive in a board context, I think that's this particular slant, isn't it? emotional intelligence, you know, sort of IQ smarts is table stakes. Over and above that, I think emotional intelligence. I think the ability to be a low ego but self-confident at the same time, so that you're able to listen and collaborate with your board, because they're there for a reason, not just to do governance, but actually to try and add some value in from their own experience set, and recognising and respecting the talent around the table and drawing on it, being able to, rather than, exactly to your point, Fiona, seeing it as some sort of either obligation or adversarial kind of arena, which I think if you've got that going on too much, I think the dynamic in the board isn't helpful. So I think somebody who is resilient, because there's a lot of change out there, and has the ability to, and I would absolutely agree, I'd use a different slight words, but I do think lateral thinking, reframe things, be able to take a lens off something and look at it in a different way, to be able to then listen, because often someone will be coming at it from a different perspective to the chief exec, and be able to sort of put themselves in their shoes and really reframe thinking. And I've always thought two heads are better than one. So a CEO that really truly believes that the board is there to add value, I think, gets you up in the right direction.
Sort of thinking back as a CEO, how long did it take for you to maybe try and get that rhythm and cadence where you felt comfortable and that it was a sense of working towards a common goal? I realise this is a journey and there's no sort of simple answer, but I think it's sort of it can take time, I think, to get that trust again between
It can. I think it
parties.
depends very much on the context. So when I became chief executive, if it was off the back of a bit of drama and stress for the business, in that I had been the CFO and the chief exec and chair and audit chair were removed by the SID, and I stepped into that chief exec role. We were in crisis and we needed to recapitalise the business. I think something like that pulls a board together very quickly, actually, because you're all trying to do the right thing for the business to help it survive. I think if you're going into something more steady state, perhaps it will take longer. So I was being invited in to come and do it. I wasn't being sort of inherited by the board. So that was quite different. I think you do need to spend time with the board collectively and individually, build that strong relationship with your chair. We didn't have a chair, obviously, because we just removed the chair. So my SID stepped in, but then we were doing a search for the chair. And ultimately, whilst I wasn't the one that got to choose, the chemistry is really, really important. And I was extremely fortunate to get John Barton, who was the chair of Next for many, many years and EasyJet, and someone who wasn't unaccustomed to fights with stakeholders. So he was very much kind of understood the territory that we were in, and therefore that didn't take a lot of time, because I think the experience set and the chemistry worked because we chose that chair.
And I guess it was clear, I guess, some of the qualities that the business needed, maybe the experience that was required.
Yeah, somebody who wasn't fazed by anything was one of the things that we wrote down.
Just quickly, you mentioned that question in the context of what distinguishes a good CEO in terms of the relationship with the board. What would be some of the other contexts, perhaps, that sort of distinguish, in your mind, a particularly strong CEO?
I think someone who can inspire and engage with the organisation, their own leadership, but actually the whole organisation. Somebody who potentially has that clear kind of purpose-led values, behaviours. It's not just what they do, it's how they do it, is equally important. I think we just heard today from Nathan, actually, somebody who is very powerful in being able to do both of those things. So, you know, the vast majority of your time is not spent with your board as a chief exec. It's spent with your business, it's spent with your leadership team, and it's spent with your team, that wider team. And so being able to be engaging with them and understand and take feedback from them, and communication goes both ways, and having the eye that actually if you're communicating out and not out in, then you're probably missing some of the things that are valuable to the business.
Yeah, the word listening has come up a few times this morning as well. And I guess people are very quick to know whether that's genuine or sort of maybe tokenistic in terms of behaviours as well. Fiona, you were nodding a couple of times there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that sense of a CEO being the leader of the organisation is absolutely critical. And it's, as you say, it's not what they're doing, it's how they're doing it is really important. I think the role as well in sort of dealing with some difficult HR issues as well. So again, a good CEO, and we talked about earlier this morning as well, the importance of dealing with those issues up front and facing them. Is also the hallmark of a good CEO. So ideally, if they're that good, they don't have too many issues with their senior executive team or within their organisation from a HR point of view. But if they do have them, then dealing with them quite quickly is also another good hallmark, in addition to the comments that Rachel's made. I also think they have to then have that element of the ambassadorial role that they'll play outside the organisation. And most CEOs that I've encountered certainly would, to your point, that's table stakes. They didn't get to be a CEO if they weren't good at the good block and tackle work of being in the media, in front of politicians, customers, stakeholders, operating possibly geographically diverse organisation, operating in different countries, etc. So I think they need to be comfortable in that space as well. But I do think listening, and again, as you say, it's obvious if it's not real. And in this busy world, even having the time to listen, whether it's real or not, is a luxury that we just need to not lose sight of.
Well, I think that also builds on the point that was made around sort of knowing how to try and simplify the role. Where is your time most valuable? Where do you need to be focusing as CEO, which I think we'll come back to. The next area I wanted to look at, and again, it has been discussed today, but I was interviewing someone on Monday, and it was a CEO, and they kept talking about the need for adaptability and agility. And I think sometimes, again, I understand it, but sometimes I'm just thought it'd be interesting to get into it a little bit deeper in this session and get your views on this. Because where do you stand on this idea of agility in leadership? Is this something new in how we're describing and talking about it? Or has it always, in effect, been an important skill and characteristic? Again, when thinking about this through the lens of the CEO. Rachel, if you wanted to.
I think it's always been important that you can be both proactive and reactive as circumstances change around you. I think what we've been seeing over the last 4 to 5 years is just the speed and pace of unexpected things being thrown at the world. Seems to have speeded up. Therefore, it just has gone higher up the priority list of things that you would expect a leadership team, a board and a chief exec to be alive to, that things change and some of them might be existential. I think it's important to work out what's a structural change versus a cyclical change, and also what's an operational thing versus a strategic disruption. And not just be agile for the sake of it. I think it was interesting this morning talking to Alex partners who have great experience in the here and now and change it and fix it because things are going to go horribly wrong. Mm-hmm. But actually, I think it's really important not to lose sight of the long term. People call it different things: purpose, North Star, mission. Where are you going, and why is this business here, and what is it going to be able to win at? And where is it going to play? You may need to be agile in changing the answers to those questions. Maybe you don't. Those things stay the same. It really depends on the circumstances. So I think it's just, and you've got to think about the organisation around you. You know, in the pandemic, great opportunity for us all to be agile in our thinking. You know, footfall changed from where it was going from inner cities to outer. You know, do you then suddenly move where all your stores are? They're long-term decisions.
No, I remember. The discussion was that like London's finished as a city, as a destination, as a centre of work, and some really big statements were made about it's all different, and
everyone's going to shop online forever and never go back to stores, and you've got to be able to distill what's for a period of time and what's permanent, and that's not easy either. So I think it's agility, but not by yourself. You've got to be able to connect with other people, other stakeholders, and be able to challenge your own thinking.
this point that's made about pace and things being faster, for you, are you clear on that? Is that absolutely the case? Would you say that we are, in terms of what's being thrown at leadership, we are moving at a much faster pace than before?
It feels it. I think all the things that are going on in the world in terms of communication, social media, the internet, globalization, the news flow, the flow of things happening is just much more quickly communicated. Maybe 100 years ago, all those things were going on, but no one was communicating it, so you weren't aware of it. So that's one thing. I think the pandemic's just thrown everything up in the air. And then the series of things that have happened since then seem to be seismic in nature, every single one of them. And so people have, I think the word relentless is something that people have said. You know, it isn't like pandemic over and breathe. You're then into wars, you're then into cost of living crises. Arguably, these things are connected in some way. Who knows? But I think it's at the moment I can't see that sort of and breathe.
It's the risk element,
coming.
Isn't it? I think that's sort of what seems to be dominating the agenda much more. Okay, so taking it back a step. I mean, where do you think first-time CEOs can struggle in terms of adjusting to the role, and maybe looking at this more through your sort of independent sort of director lens? Where do you think they need support, and where can we provide support?
I think there's, again, the context is very important here. So again, we just listened to Nathan this morning. So if you have been in the business, that's one thing. If you've been a CFO and you step up as Rachel has into the CEO role, that's another factor. And indeed, Sean as well on my panel this morning had been the CFO and became the CEO. So I think they will struggle with that move from being a sort of amongst the group of the executive team and then suddenly being the stepping up into that role. So they'll have their colleagues who they might have all been arrayed in a gang on the senior executive team, and they would have all shared their pain and suffering together. Suddenly one of them is the boss of everybody else, and that can create certainly a dynamic for an incoming CEO if they've already been in the organisation. And then the converse of that, of course, is that if they're parachuted into an organisation, they have a lot of work to do to make sure that they can build trust and respect with their management team. And that's born out of, again, all the things we talked about in terms of their personal style, their listening, their emotional intelligence, and of course their expertise and experience in the business. Because the first thing the executive team are going to look to see is, well, let's show me the evidence that you are qualified in the broadest sense to be in that chair. And I think that if you suffer from imposter syndrome, if you have maybe a little bit of confidence issues as well, that'll certainly be a struggle for you. And meanwhile, concurrently with that, as Rachel said, you've got to build a relationship with your board, who may or may not, if it's a new CEO, they'll have hired you. So they will, certainly for the first honeymoon phase, they'll be thinking that you're the greatest thing that ever happened and came through the door because they hired you, the chair particularly. And so there is a kind of a honeymoon period with the board that hired a CEO, but that can end then when things don't work out, or it can continue and it can strengthen and go from strength to strength. And I certainly at CIE was able to have the privilege of hiring my CEO, and that has worked out really, really well. And I'd like to think for both of us. So I think that there's those challenges, and then just I guess having the personal resilience, and we talked about agility, but to deal with the absolutely crazy inbox that you will have as a CEO. I think that was the point that Nathan made as well, is that you think you kind of know what the job is, but then you have this complete left field thing that happens in a part of your organisation that you just hadn't even considered. We had some issue at Network Rail around, something to do with biodiversity and badger sets, and that was a massive political issue for the CEO. And it didn't matter that meanwhile we were bleeding money on another side or dealing with strikes somewhere else.
Had to be dealt with.
Had to be dealt with, it's politically sensitive, etc. Or it's something, again, going back to a sensitive HR issue or a protected disclosure or some whistleblowing that might could be going on in the organisations. Because the organisations can have lots of really messy stuff going on within them. Usually people related, it has to be said. So I think that it's having that, and then not being afraid to admit that you're not perfect, not being afraid to ask for help, not being afraid to be humble. But those things will come with as we described earlier, an emotionally aware and high EI CEO will kind of know that anyway.
Okay. Rachel, feel free to build on that. But again, when you stepped into that group CEO role, or even maybe as a group CFO, like where did you sort of look for guidance and support. I guess because there's always a slight conflict with the board, in a sense, because say from a chair perspective, you
you
hire and
can't.
fire.
You can. Yeah, I mean, you as a new CEO, you can't be showing your weakness
No.
to your chair who likes to think that you're absolutely amazing. That happens over time. If there's a weak, I mean, the CEO, and again, a good chair would spot that, and then they work together to neutralise that. But I'll let Rachel come in on that specifically.
I, as a CEO, I did not do this as a CFO, and I wonder why, and I think it might be because I didn't find the right person, but I looked for a mentor outside of the organisation who had gone through the journey of being a CEO in the sector that I was in, so that I could have safe conversations outside the board arena. And just check in that I'm thinking this, am I losing the plot, and actually these are the circumstances. And I found that mentorship very powerful for the first, let's say, year. That allowed me then to have useful conversations with the chair.
Okay.
But where I sought kind of guidance and support was mentor, chair. And then I think, depending on, again, the circumstances, we were going through quite a lot of stuff as an organisation, so my advisors. So the external advisors, again, I looked to them for various specialist capabilities that we didn't have as an executive team. Obviously my exec. And then I think as a CEO, keep your HRD, the whole people agenda thing is so huge. HRD very close, and I used him, I think, as a coach sometimes with those more difficult people things. This is what I'm thinking, how should we go about it? And he was so values driven and such a wonderful individual. I knew his instincts were ones that I trusted. So I think, but it's finding that group that works for you. But that was the group that kind of worked for me.
There was no point where you thought I could do this on my own.
No. I mean, you make the decisions ultimately. Again, I think someone said this morning, you get all the tricky decisions, the easy decisions.
Yeah,
get made elsewhere. That was a good one. Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah.
But ultimately, whilst I am and prefer to be collaborative in style, and two heads are better than one, ultimately, after a long debate, a decision does need to be made. You have to make that decision, and so you can't necessarily rely on someone else to do that. You are the chief exec.
Yeah, and I think and for me as chair, and I've been a CEO as well, but in a different sector, one of the challenges I find is if I have a strongly different view from my CEO, and it's rare, but I sometimes do, and I might want to take a different direction. And in my chairing, I have tended to always side with the CEO. It has to be said, on the basis that they're in the business. They have to deal with the consequences of me having a rush of blood to the head and wanting to do something silly or dramatic. But as I reflect back on that over my tenures, there have been times where I feel I probably could have been a bit braver as the chair, and that is a unique role. But I didn't want to lose the support of the CEO in doing that. And so, and I still struggle with that, because you want, that relationship is so crucial.
I mean, that's an art, isn't it? Trying to
and you don't want to. And so I'm now at a stage where I could have a conversation with the CEO to say, we have a difference of opinion on this particular approach, and I need to try my way, but my way, even that language is not right, because it's our way. Mm-hmm. It's just a different way of doing whatever it might be. So it might be calling something, selling something, doing something, agreeing something, disagreeing something. And it's often around difficult negotiations would be where I find this plays out most. I've difficult issues, sometimes difficult issues with unions. I've got worker directors, I've got pension issues, and I might have wanted to be more or less aggressive at different points of time in that negotiation. And then you have to respect the fact that the executive has to then deal with the consequences of mm-hmm. that. So I think that there's still a little bit of, and that's probably good tension to have. But as I look back on my time, and particularly as I'm coming to the end of my 2 years, or my 2 terms at CIE, there have been times where I wished I had been a little bit more self-directed and been prepared to take the consequences of that if I'd called it wrong. Because I've taken comfort appropriately in it being a joint decision, really, between the board and the executive, which manifests itself between the chair and the CEO, let's be honest. But there are times when I think maybe it would have been better for the organisation if I had been a little bit more
a little
separate.
bit more grit in some
Yeah,
of those
and
conversations.
only time, well, not so much time will tell. And I think about future roles, I do certainly think that I would be calling things a little earlier. I feel that in times I have capitulated to things that I wouldn't now, but 5 years ago I did. You know, and of course then if I had then the opposite may be the case. If I had a very gung-ho aggressive CEO, I might have been always the one pulling back. So it depends.
There's the weight of the conversation, isn't it? Okay. In our various research reports this year, the need to strengthen leadership capability has repeatedly appeared in the sort of top 3 priorities to focus on over the next 12 months. So this is across research that we conducted with HRDs, from our Chair and NED research, and execs at our Asia Leadership Retreat last month in Singapore. Why do you think that's such an area of focus right now in terms of prioritising strengthening leadership capability? So Rachel, did you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think if you think about the last 5 years, and certainly my understanding from retail, a lot of chief executives have left. They've done their stuff and that's it. 3 years, I'm exhausted, pandemic, enough. So there has been quite a lot of churn in that chief executive space, certainly in that industry. And therefore, people are new in role, and perhaps sort of, didn't have the kind of longer run at it that we heard about this morning, an 18-month handover. I've never seen one of those. I think that's wow, a sort of no-month handover, often in these circumstances. And so I think just with that change and shift, there's a concern that is this new generation of leaders, they're not tried and tested. We need to therefore give them all the tools that are going to enable them to be able to drive and lead businesses through this if they haven't had a long time doing it before. I think there's a little bit of that maybe, but it really depends on the industry.
It does.
And there may be other things as well in different industries that are causing that thought.
Okay.
And I probably have, from my experience, somewhat of the opposite problem, in that if you think about large state bodies and public sector bodies, you don't have sufficient turnover. You might want more turnover. In fact, you invariably will want more turnover. So you're often stuck with what you've got, and so you can't pay as much as the open market. So you're always chasing talent, but at a lower price point, and that's a challenge. Now, sometimes the terms and conditions, or the location, or the context suits somebody, and you can get a really good person who's prepared to take 30-40% less than they could get in the open market to do a certain role. And I work with a lot of people in that category. The problem then is that they, as I say, if they don't work out, they're jobs for life, and getting any kind of moving them on is very difficult. So I think that in that situation, then it's providing a clear path to leadership for the wider sort of middle management and then senior management, because again, my view is you've got fantastic talent lower down in the organisation, and they can feel blocked because again, that the opposite problem, there's no gaps opening up, and then they just get disheartened, and they're not going to necessarily go anywhere because the organisation might suit them. They may have a reason for being there. So it's really about making sure that you have looked into that. Now I've seen, and I'm sure Rachel as well, I've seen so many succession planning documents, ready up successors, 1 year out, 2 year out, 3 years out. And these are, to me, they are quite dead documents. I really need to, and I'm always challenging my CEO, give me evidence, show me where we've done something.
Why do you think they're dead?
Because I think that you only review them once a year. Someone may move from one quadrant to the other quadrant. It's quite, when I say it's dead, it's a very single dimensional view of your succession planning, and it needs to be brought to life. And I think then the board needs to see. That's why, for example, I'm a great believer in seeing not just the executive team at the board, but again, relevant experts across a sector. So you bring in somebody who might be mid-ranking and to present a paper, and I see that work quite well. I think that gives them some exposure to the board. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there as well. I also think that, again, looking at how we evaluate leadership potential as well, and I think we have to be aware of our sort of unconscious bias about what I think is a good leader. We've talked about this on this podcast, but I look at I've got young adult children, so I've got 23, 25 and 26, and their sense of who they will be led by and what leaders they will be is very different. And so I think that element, and I made that point earlier, we have not future-proofed, and I'm talking about sort of 20 years out, I'm not talking about 5 years out, because the 5 years out you can see, you can look into your organisation and you can see, but who's going to lead the companies, the organisations into the future? And a bit like politics, You know, we need good people to go into the workforce and to be inspired to be leaders, whether it's political or whether it's in a corporate setting. And it's not exactly that attractive, that leadership part. They might like the salary, they might like the job they're doing, and it's a means to an end. But you have to really inspire people to want to be leaders, and that's by showcasing. It can be fun, but I think that, and then from a leadership point of view as well, is that I also observe at a couple of the situations I'm in where I think we can be quite hard on people as well. So when we're doing those steady up succession and we're talking about people's abilities, I often feel that we're quite critical of people and I'm thinking, and I'm a great believer in giving people a chance to fail as opposed and a chance to succeed.
Because it is amazing how people can grow into
absolutely.
a role and really surprise
and
you when you give them a chance.
Yeah, I really believe in that. So when I sit and listen to people, as I do at board meetings, talking about another person who's 2 years out from succeeding into a head of risk role, for example, but they're this and they're that and they haven't got this and they haven't got that. I'm like, yeah, but they're still here. They're showing up for work every day. They're doing a good job. I'm like, let's give them a chance, but that's not necessarily how that process works. And because, to Rachel's point, it's not like there's 10 of them out in the marketplace, and particularly in my case, ready to take less money. I'm like, let's really invest in what we've got and see what we can do with them. And then people, in my experience, if you literally shine a little light on them, most people blossom. Most people blossom.
Another thought around why strengthening leadership is sort of bubbling up as a one of the top 3 priorities. We talked about it earlier in this podcast, the sheer level of uncertainty and change and disruption that's going on in the world. You need people to rise to the top of organisations and create some certainty. Whether it's certain or not, leadership is around taking a stand. And organisations, especially people lower down who are panicked about whether I've got a job, what's my business going to be doing in 5 years' time, need to look to something that inspires them to work towards and create and deliver something. And that is really about leadership. So probably that sort of ability to manage in extreme ambiguity and create certainty where you can for an organisation is something that is really, really important for businesses to have in their top team right now.
Yeah, it's painting a picture of the future, isn't it? Yes, okay, there's lots of uncertainty, but this is the direction of travel. Yeah.
And I learned that when I was a CEO, I actually ran our national library, so like the equivalent of the British Library. And but I had a tiny staff, so it wasn't as big as the British Library. But again, that capacity for, and I was all about transformation and leading change and all this great stuff. And that was my big life lesson, was that I hadn't painted the destination. I hadn't painted the journey. So I was happy to describe the journey, I should say, but I hadn't painted the destination. For people who don't like change, we talked about that earlier on, the antithesis of those that are adaptable or agile. And a lot of people are just born not liking change. And I had underestimated that. I have a high tolerance for change, doesn't bother me at all. But I really learned in that role that I had not brought. So I was at the top of the hill, about to charge over whatever.
But you didn't have anyone behind you.
And I turned around and there was no one behind me. And that was a big wake-up call for me. And I'd like to think I brought that into my future working.
What advice would you give to a new CEO to maximise their chances of success in the role?
Be authentic. Be
What does
yourself.
that mean?
It means be yourself, be comfortable with yourself, but also share that. So you can be authentically yourself and not share it with anybody. That's no value to anyone. People want to see that their leaders are people that they can relate to and be inspired by. But if you can open up about yourself, be honest, be who you are, and that allows people around you to be who they are. And there's nothing worse than spending all your time at work pretending to be someone you're not. So I think authenticity is important for everybody, but follow the leader, right? So be comfortable in your own skin to be authentic, and don't feel you have to be this superhero, because you're not. You're there because you have some skills, but I think, it's really important to sort of let people connect with you on a human level, especially with the uncertainty and everything that's going around that we talked about. Find your trusted advisors, that group of people you can turn to and that you will listen to, that help you make those better decisions as you go through. And understand the complexity of all of your stakeholders. they're going to be new. You won't have had this complexity of stakeholders before. Even if you've been in that sort of C-suite, it's much more complicated. So spend time understanding their perspectives.
There's not much more I can add to that. That's understanding what's important and what you can influence. So again, prioritising, because it's only 12 hours in the working day. There shouldn't even be 12 hours, but there are at least. So I think in addition to the comments that Rachel's made, tone from the top, and you talked about authenticity, tone from the top, again, it trips off the tongue like we just all know it and have internalized it, but it is true. There's no question about that. It is true. As a new CEO or even an existing CEO, take some time to step outside the job. Whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, but take a good chunk of time to just sit with yourself, with your thoughts, with your reflections, a piece of paper, and then just think, what can I do differently, better next week, tomorrow, in the next hour? And I think that can be really powerful. A simple tool, but I think it gives you, it can ground you and settle you back and root you back in your role.
Okay. Right, well, I'll have to wrap it up there. So thank you, Fiona Ross and Rachel Osborne, for that today. As I said at the start, this episode is part of Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders series, which can be found on Podbean and Spotify. Please do subscribe to our channel to be notified of new episodes. Plus, for more information about how we support leaders and senior teams at Criticaleye, please visit our website at www.criticaleye.com. Thanks for listening.